And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Financial Times reports Western pleas over Ukraine failed to sway African and South American leaders. U.S. and European leaders struggle to convince rest of the world that Russia's invasion, quote unquote, is a threat to all. What are we to make of this? Well, for insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Boers Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time, and his latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Western leaders used an important security meeting in Munich to make the case that Russia's quote-unquote invasion of Ukraine posed a threat not just to Europe, but to the whole world. There was little evidence their message got through. U.S. Vice President Harris said, "No nation is safe in a world where one country can violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of another." Dr. Horne, I think she needs to take some classes from you, because she doesn't seem to understand history.
Well, certainly she should be the physician that heals herself. When she points the finger of accusation, justifiably, she has three fingers pointing back at her and Washington. She should seek to talk to the Iraqis and the Afghanis and the Libyans and others too numerous to mention about violation of territorial integrity. In some ways, it reminds me of that 1980s tune, We Are the World, which ironically, though it was supposed to be raising money for folks in East Africa, given the lineup of the artists, they seem to be unintentionally suggesting that the North Atlantic folk are the world, and they are the only people who count. Now, I think that part of the reason, understandably, why the so-called global South has difficulty in accepting the plaints from the North Atlantic bloc is because the global South has been victimized repeatedly to this very day by the North Atlantic countries. But suddenly they're supposed to see the North Atlantic countries as the so-called good guys riding to the rescue. However, there is a tell, as they say in mystery novels, that tell being that the North Atlantic countries rarely talk about observing international law. They talk about the so-called rules-based order, which is a fiction, something that's made up, and something that's meant to be a disguise for the continuation of the status quo, a status quo that is not only unsustainable, but a status quo which many in the global South reject. Keep in mind that this week, South Africa, a major target of these North Atlantic complaints, was holding military maneuvers with Russia and China off the South African coast. We also know that other African nations, too numerous to mention, do not accept this idea that what's going on in Ukraine is somehow a threat to their livelihood and territorial integrity. If anything, as evidenced by the complaints coming from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea-Conakry about France, Africa sees the North Atlantic countries as the major threat to their security, livelihood, and territorial integrity. And it's as plain as the nose on your face, and why it can't be recognized in Brussels and Washington and London and Paris is beyond befuddlement.
Well, I can see where Kamala Harris went bad right here. She said, the article says, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris said, quote, "No nation is safe in a world where one country can violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of another. In the context of history, the global South know that far better than Kamala Harris could ever express in words. And her problem is she says that in the context of a false narrative where the U.S. is the guarantor of peace. And these people have a lived experience where they know what that really means." Dr. Horne.
Well, I think that Vice President Harris, with due respect, is not necessarily on the same path and page with her North Atlantic comrades. I paid careful and close attention to the speech given by President Macron at the recent Munich Security Conference. And on the one hand, he made it clear that he was a team player willing to go down the line for this failed venture in Ukraine. But the undertone, easily discernible, was recriminations towards his North Atlantic comrades, who he suggested are interested in regime change in Moscow. He pointed out that regime change has a very odious and failed record historically. You need only look at Libya, amongst other examples too numerous to mention. And the problem for France, of course, is that it's so dependent upon U.S. imperialism to maintain its neo-empire in Africa, which is fraying, as suggested a moment or two ago by my remarks about Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea-Conakry. But that dependence leaves France in a very ticklish position. And so Vice President Harris, if she has the opportunity going forward, should really have a heart-to-heart conversation with President Macron of France, because she obviously needs to be briefed on global realities.
Well, not only Macron of France, but she probably needs to have a conversation with Scholz in Germany. And she might even want to have a discussion with the prime minister in London.
Well, certainly it's apparent that Prime Minister Sunak in London is not as enthusiastic about this Ukrainian escapade as his predecessors, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson. However, Mr. Sunak is understandably concerned that Boris Johnson wants to make a comeback. And so Prime Minister Sunak is trying to protect his right flank by being very performative in his so-called support for Ukraine, which the British budget, which is fraying at the edges, will not allow him to deliver on. And with regard to Mr. Scholz, he hardly is on speaking terms with his foreign minister, who is more hawkish than he is, even though she's supposedly agreeing. And certainly Germany is buzzing about the Seymour Hersh story about United States and Norway bombing this pipeline carrying natural gas from Russia into Germany. And Mr. Chancellor Scholz has to pay attention to that. So despite all of the smiles and fist bumps and all the rest at the Munich Security Conference, it's apparent that that alliance has a lot of repair that's overdue.
And you're talking about the repercussions in Germany related to the Sy Hersh story. That takes me to my next question, which is you've talked about these foreign ministers and prime ministers walking a fine line. Well, as we see the polling and in the United States, Americans are getting more fed up with this Ukraine foolishness. Seymour Hersh's story is pulling the covers off of this. So how long do you think Sunak and Scholz, that they can continue to walk this fine line before the movement in the streets really starts to reverberate into their houses of government and parliament?
Well, you see hints of that, believe it or not, in the United States of America. I know that may come as a surprise to many, but there's been quite a juxtaposition about the so-called bomb train in East Palestine, Ohio, and the polluting of the water, the polluting of people's bodies, and how the Biden regime has been asleep at the switch. The Transportation Secretary, Mayor Pete, has yet to visit this deteriorating, declining town. At the same time, Mr. Biden has the gumption to fly to Kiev and pledge hundreds of millions of more U.S. tax dollars for Ukraine, as his own backyard is deteriorating and declining sharply. And it's going to be very difficult for Mr. Biden to maintain that contradiction. And if Mr. Biden cannot maintain that contradiction, then you can only imagine what's going to befall Mr. Macron in France, who in the past few weeks has faced the specter of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of workers on the streets complaining about his domestic programs. At the same time, he too is pledging French tax dollars for a failed experiment in Ukraine.
You know, when I think of that infamous photo of the snake eating its tail, it makes me think of the Seymour Hersh article and what's going on now. His article, How America Took Out the Nord Stream Pipeline. But additionally, Seymour Hersh has been doing a number of interviews lately. I watched one the other day on Consortium News Live. They had him, and one of the things that he said was, "quote, this is only first base. There's no more to come." He implied that he's working on some other things. And it sounds to me, Dr. Horne, like there is a fight going on inside this neocon machine, and it's now spilling out into the open via these leaks to Seymour Hersh. Your thoughts?
I think there's something to that, but the problem is this is not an ordinary crisis. It's evidenced by the fact that Moscow apparently is going to be pulling out of the New START treaty because it fears that inspectors who come to some of their nuclear bases will then be communicating intelligence to the Ukrainians, who then will seek to bomb said bases. At the same time, you see the dust-up between Wang Yi, the Chinese state counselor and overseer of Chinese foreign policy, during the Munich meeting with Secretary of State Blinken, when he did take kindly to the threats issued not only by Mr. Blinken, but also by Linda Thomas Greenfield, who really should know better, the United States ambassador to the United Nations. And so we're quickly and clearly having a crisis that's spinning out of control. But since we're talking about nuclear powers on the Chinese and Russian side, this is no ordinary crisis. This is not Afghanistan, folks. This is not Iraq. This is not Libya. Finally, the United States is taking on someone its own size. And I'm afraid to say that the consequences may be dire indeed for Washington.
We have just about a minute and a half left. We've got economists saying that what this is the beginning of a long-term, a 10-year, 15-year economic war that the United States is trying to engage in. I don't think it can last that long. 30 seconds, Dr. Horne.
Well, I take it that you're making reference to de-dollarization, the rapid movement away from the U.S. dollar, which will complicate the ability of the United States to utilize the printing press to pay for imports, to pay bondholders, not to mention the apparent default that might just be over the horizon, which could send the United States going quickly south rather soon.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.